I think we have a really great panel today. We're going to go ahead and jump into it, and I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves. We'll get into understanding what regenerative public goods for sustainable communities actually looks like. Cool. So, Kevin, we can start with you, brother, and you can go ahead and introduce yourselves, and you guys go down, and we'll take it from there.
Yep. Hey, I'm Kevin Iwaki. I'm an American software engineer and entrepreneur. I'm mostly known for founding Gitcoin, which has funded about $65 million worth of public goods and open source software in the Ethereum ecosystem.
All right. David Casey here. I run a organization called Funding the Commons. We do conferences, hackathons, and residencies exploring funding mechanisms for public goods, as well as we've been starting to run funding experiments.
My name is Michel Bowens. I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation, which is basically an observatory of all things peer-to-peer. In this kind of audience, I like to say it's where Satoshi published his white paper. I don't look like it, but I'm in a sense a local because I've lived in Chiang Mai for 20 years now.
And apparently the first person who tweeted about Bitcoin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
nice. Cool. So the first thing we want to talk about is what actually are regenerative public goods for sustainable communities. And I think this conversation is really important because one of the things we haven't wrapped our head around at all with parallel societies, public goods in general, is first of all that there's a governance concern. There's a concern around how we govern these communities, and especially how we get funding into these communities that can be stable and regenerative and allow these communities to grow over time. So this is really going to be a focus of the discussion. So let these guys take it from here. What are regenerative public goods for sustainable communities?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the easiest thing to do is take that word by word. So public goods are things that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. They're goods that are hard to produce and sell via a scarcity-based model, like something you would get when you purchase something on the internet, because they're just things that are available for free and they can't be excluded. So things like open source software are public goods. And public goods can be a huge value add to society, but one of the problems that we have in our economies is that it's really hard to encourage entrepreneurs to work on public goods because they have no way to monetize them. And so that's the public goods part of the phrase. And then the next word on there is regenerative, which to me just means that the resource availability of the system goes up over time, as opposed to a degenerative system, which is degenerating its public goods over time. So to me, regenerative public goods just means that you're getting more resource availability of public goods like open source software, cryptography, and things of that nature in your ecosystem.
All right. Yeah, I think he basically encapsulated it. I would add that a regenerative public good, the way I look at it, is a public good that continues to regenerate and grow itself over time, or in other words, expand its capacity to do public good. And getting into the sustainable communities piece, when a funding stream is continuous, a community is able to plan over time. Whereas if a funding stream is kind of one-off grants that a community is struggling to reach for and continuing to expend time and energy seeking funding, then it becomes less sustainable.
Yeah, and guys, when you talk about this too, it seems like there is an asymmetry or a disconnect between traditional funding models versus some of the funding models that you guys are discussing. Can you maybe elaborate on that as well as, like, historically, how have these systems been funded, or what does funding look like historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you say traditional funding models, I think of market-based funding models where I pay you X and you give me Y, and you get some revenue from producing that good, and I get the good, and you get a signal that the market has demand for that because I purchased that from you. And the problem with public goods is that there's traditionally in many societies they've been provided by the government, And the government, as we all know, has a model where they collect taxes from their citizens and then they try to administer national public goods, things like national defense, transportation networks, clean air, clean water, things like that. I feel really unpopular talking about statism at a crypto conference, but the one thing I'll say here is that I envision a 2x2 matrix here of public versus private goods is the x-axis, and then is there a market signal about what people are demanding or not as the other axis. And you can kind of think of private goods as they're private goods, which means they're excludable and they're rivalrous, and you get a good entrepreneurs get a good signal from the market of what's available and what's not. And then the other quadrant is a public good where someone in the government doesn't really have a good sense as a central producer or as a central power broker of what the market is actually demanding. And so basically, I think that the holy grail of these systems for me is to produce public goods, but to actually have input, a market feedback mechanism to what public goods are in demand from the body politic, whether that's a geographic body politic or a DAO or a crypto ecosystem's body politic. For me, that's the holy grail, is a public good where there's actually signal and intelligence in the network of where to provision public goods. And to me, designing a good capital allocation mechanism for public goods is solving that problem, is moving across that 2x2 matrix of getting a public good provisional system that also generates signal.
Yeah, exactly. And I would add, in other words, that the communities at the grassroots level are often most connected to the needs, and similar to market signals, it's how to integrate the feedback from the grassroots into the systems rather than prescribing or assuming solutions from the top down, which often, in the case of kind of nation states and more kind of hierarchically structured systems with good intentions, fail because of a lack of feedback signals and, in Kevin's words, market signals.
Yeah, maybe I can give a bit of a historical arc. So I think basically empires have commons, which are local, self-organized communities, which kind of function as have a dampening effect on the extractiveness of the imperial system. Then under capitalism, basically the commons are enclosed. They tend to disappear and they're replaced by the state. So I think we should make a difference between commons goods and public goods. And public goods, in my eyes, are defined as, more linked to the state. And the problem with the state, public goods, of course, is that they atomize people in consumers of the state, of a state service. So they kind of tend to destroy the local solidarity. And I think in this period, because of the transnationality of finance, the capacity of the state to provide public good is weakening. And so we're looking for alternatives, and the alternatives might be what we are trying to do, which is translocal funding of local common goods. And so that's kind of new that we're trying to do this, is to create a new system to fund commons goods, right? And I think it's probably also worth stressing that public goods, in my view, need to have some connection with nature, with material reality. So, not just coders that work separately, but is it really kind of rooted in the material world? Are we regenerating the material world? I think that's an important criterion. I like the example of Regenerative, right, where you have a planetary ledger, an ecological state. An ecological state is a set of 36 metrics that reflect the state of nature. And so you always know whether you're degrading or regenerating the environment in which you operate. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. What I'm hearing is there's this more of an ecology of grassroots-based funding that's emerging both in potentially crypto and blockchain, but also just in the communities themselves. So it's like, to use a term that's been used before, there's a crowdfunding sort of aspect to this as well. So we'll play on this a little bit more, and I'm curious about what have the challenges around getting different communities funded look like. So Michel got into it a little bit, but go Go ahead. What would you see
Yeah.
as a
Well, I actually did a study of 500 urban commons projects in the city of Ghent in 2016. And actually, typically, it will be two people that get a half-time wage from an NGO and are working 16 hours a day. So they're totally undercapitalized, underfunded. And so my dream is, of course, that while we are doing in Web3, and I say we are, although I'm kind of an outsider, but anyway, in the sense of, we're creating this global coordination mechanism to translocally coordinate labor and the funding of that labor, right? But I think we need to go down to productive capacity. Some of the funding that we use for ourselves, I think, should be directed to the people who do resilient material production at a local level. And that will make them a lot stronger. So what I imagine, and this is not happening yet, but, just let's use our imagination, is let's say we have the local level and they create a cosmic unity, right? They have a global knowledge and protocol commons that can basically help every node in that network. And then maybe there's a translocal network of ownership that owns a bit of the local, and the local owns a little of the global. And so you have this entanglement between the local and the transnational level. And I think this is what we're trying to do in a way. That what's new in history is that we now have a technology for translocal self-organization, which I don't think we had before. And this is basically, changing the very nature of civilization, because civilization is a geographic system that linked the urban to the rural. And now we're creating this wholly new layer on top of it. And that's the really challenge, is how is that going to work together? And what's the role of the nation state sitting kind of in the middle of those two levels? Is it going to continue to exist? Is it going to destroy one or the other? There's many issues around that.
So I'm going to this is interesting. I want to play on this, and I know that David has some thoughts, but I'm trying to understand where in your translocal vision, in this grassroots vision, where is the actual value being accrued? Where is the funds actually coming from? I don't know. I'm not completely clear on that, but I think that David as well will have some thoughts on where it can come from a blockchain perspective. But I'm curious where you're at.
I think the value can only come locally. I mean, you need a surplus of the rural to invest in the urban. You need a surplus urban workers to produce in the cognitive layer. So it's really labor and nature that creates wealth. And then we have created this monetary system that unfortunately doesn't really reflect in a very good way what's happening on the ground. So there's a lot of fictive and speculative value that is not grounded in anything real. Especially now with this kind of like hyper creation of fiat money. And so I think the good news about crypto is that we now have the capacity to create thermodynamically informed currencies, right? And as Holochain says, currencies seeing currents, which the current money doesn't see. We suppose that we see it, but we can actually not see what we do to nature. And the essential problem of the capitalist economy is externalization, right? Is that in order to be cheap and competitive, you basically push as much as you can on the side and you don't see the impact. And in order to create a new balance between nature and humanity, we need to integrate that vision of externalities, and basically they have to become internalities. And I think the technology we're building is a technology that is able to do that. Contributory accounting allows us to see, contributions that are not working for the market. Public goods funding is an example of contributory accounting. We recognize that kind of work that the market doesn't fund. We can have flow accounting, 3D accounting in an open ecosystem. And we can have thermodynamic accounting, which is actually seeing flows of matter and energy. And all these technologies exist today, are experimented with. It's just that they're not integrated yet. And that's kind of the challenge.
Yeah, playing off of seeing currents, I wanted to talk about some experiments we're running with a partner organization in Africa right now, using blockchain-based public goods funding infrastructure to fund projects in refugee communities. And what we're finding is that when a community proposes what the needs are and proposes a budget for how to resolve those needs, they can do it a lot more cheaply than if a project is kind of prescribed from an international body, and then contractors are charging 300, 400, 500%, and the funds are used much more inefficiently. And doubling down on seeing the currents, we recently had the privilege of observing in action a Bitcoin-based multi-sig system that saw the donors, the beneficiaries and recipients, all the contractors, vendors, and stakeholders and community members collectively observing the multi-sig, where the payments were going, how the funds were being spent. And this kind of transparent system for public goods funding infrastructure, which blockchains are particularly well enabled for, is I think a really, really interesting tool that we're just starting to see how much more efficient we can use funding at the grassroots level.
Absolutely. And Kevin, you have a lot of experience at Gitcoin with thinking about the way that these funding mechanisms can actually work and what they look like. So maybe, I know you've talked a lot about quadratic funding and its implementation. Can you maybe speak to that, and with relation to what these guys are saying, how is that relevant?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so quadratic funding is a mechanism for funding public goods, and it's been the primary mechanism behind Gitcoin over the last 4 years. We are going multi-mechanism. We're starting to do retroactive funding and guilds and conviction voting and a bunch of other mechanisms. But we have done a lot of quadratic funding. We've done $65 million worth of quadratic funding over 5 million transactions to about 5,000 different grantees. And basically, we're putting this into practice. And before I tell you what it is, I just want to say that Glenn Weiland, Vitalik Buterin, and Zoe Hitzig are the ones who invented this mechanism. I did not invent this mechanism. I'm just putting it into practice. But basically, the way it works is that you put together a matching pool, and you let grants or just projects, people who are doing stuff in the community, apply to be a part of a matching round, and then contributions to those grants are matched for during the round, usually a 2-week period. Contributions to those grants are matched by contributions from the matching pool. But there's one weird trick that makes it work, and that's that the grants matching, the amount that they get is based more on the number of contributions than they get, more so than the amount that was funded. And so if you raise $100 from 100 contributors and I raise $100 from one contributor, you're going to get 99% of the matching pool, because that's how the math works in quadratic funding. TLDR, the opinions of the rich and the few matter less than the poor and the many. So we're democratizing the allocation decision from a central power broker who's up in their ivory tower figuring out how to fund public goods to something that actually creates a signal in the market of what does the body politic actually care about within these ecosystems. And so that's really the cool idea, is to democratize the funding decision and to create a market signal for what people actually care about. But there's 2 Achilles heels with quadratic funding. The first is the Sybil and collusion problem. Basically, if I'm going to deploy that $100 to my project, why don't I just make up 100 different identities and make it seem like my project is broadly popular? So, and then another flavor of that problem is that I could bribe all 100 of you to contribute to my project to get to drain the matching pool. So those are solvable problems. I can get into how Gitcoin has approached that through the 22 rounds that we've run. And that's the Achilles heel number 1 of quadratic funding. The second Achilles heel is, how do you top up the matching pool? We have been really lucky at Gitcoin to get early support from the Ethereum Foundation, from Vitalik, from NFT projects and DeFi projects that contributed to the matching pool. And we got a large donation of dog coins back in 2021 that we now have a $20 million matching pool. And so if we do $1 million per quarter, we're funded for the next 20 quarters. And so very privileged to to have made a lot of progress on those two Achilles heels of quadratic funding. But, for a project like Logos or any other project that has a treasury largely of its own tokens, one of the really natural things you can do is you can deploy your own currency to the matching pool. And that's a great way to administer public goods in your ecosystem. It's not the only way to administer public goods in your ecosystem, but I think of it as one tool in the toolbox. There's other tools out there as well, but quadratic funding is just one of these constructions that can work really well, and I think has been proven out somewhat in the Ethereum community.
I can't tell you how happy I am that you mentioned Logos just now. So, well, it gets me thinking, this is really vital and critical for just what we're doing at Logos, right? We have a suite of technologies that are all public goods, right? Or common goods, to use Michelle's eloquent term. So thinking about funding for parallel societies and parallel networks, which is largely, at least in the digital space, common goods. So what does that look like for you guys for parallel societies, for funding parallel societies? What's that look like, and what's the future of it look like?
So I'm going to tee this one up for Michelle and see what you have to say about it.
Well, yes, okay. So I think what's new is this kind of direct link within the local and the translocal. And I also think we are moving to a new value regime. Like every big societal revolution is a value regime change, right? Like in feudal times, we believed the value came from the land, and then after the 16th century, we believed that value came from labor and the market. And I think that what we're finding now is that value is contributory, right? So if value is only a commodity that comes from scarcity, then you have to push everything non-scarce out of the way. And this is what we did for 4 centuries. And nature doesn't look in a very good state because of it. So we need to reintegrate the notion of contribution. And I think this is very important because this is a weird kind of tunnel I'm making, but I'm reading this thesis about how the early Christian monastics revolutionized the notion of work. Because for the Romans and the Greeks, work was for the slaves. And they said, no, ora et labora, work and pray. So work became something that was really valuable, a way of basically putting the divine in the world and making the world a better place. But in the 16th century, we made labor into a commodity again. So labor became empty, and you have to find a job to survive. And that's not necessarily a meaningful job, right? It's you just need money to survive and to eat. But look at what we are doing. We're creating open ecosystems where we can see what everybody's doing, and then we can freely associate our passionate skills to a common project. So this is a revolution in how we see labor, right? So here's then the thing is that I think that we do that locally and translocally at the same time. And that means that a portion of our value can go to the translocal to strengthen the local. And that's what I call the cosmolocal, right? So everything heavy is local and everything light is global and shared. And so let me just say this thing. So it's about regulation of society, right? So the empire controls the market, and the commons still exist. In capitalism, the commons are enclosed, and the state regulates the market. Then the market escapes from the state because it's transnational and it's no longer regulated. And that's why for 40 years, people feel powerless because it doesn't matter who you vote for. You can't change it at the national level. And what it means is, in my view, we have to inflate the commons, right? Because otherwise we have to inflate the state again, and that would mean a world government. I don't think that's a good idea. But if we inflate commons institutions, then we have a counterpower to trans-financial capital, right? And look at what we do with capital. We actually turn capital into a contribution, right? We talk about quadratic funding. We say, yeah, it's good to have capital. We use it to fund public goods. So we turn capital into commons infrastructure. And then we have a voting mechanism which recognizes the contribution of capital, or at the same time we limit it, right? Through this quadratic voting system. So I think we're doing a lot of good things in Web3, which in a way, if you want to look historically, you should have a look at medieval cities, run by the guilds in association with their own legislative systems, a very distributed system of power. And I'm pretty sure this is where we're going.
Building on the Cosmo-local analogy, we just ran a month-long open source developer residency over in Chiang Mai, and it was an interesting mix of the global and the local, bringing in kind of experimental public goods funding mechanisms, bringing in local developers and local and regional NGOs, and building solutions together here for the Southeast Asian context. And then some of which are applicable globally, and leveraging open source technology. We're basically building in the open, and so that's an ongoing experiment we're getting into. And I wanted to go back to something you said about kind of value systems and how we measure value, and accounting systems, and what the Regen Network has been doing. And I just wanted to give you guys an analogy of how broken I think our accounting system is. So this is a example from an economist named Herman Daly, ecological economist, who also had a background in biology. And he gives the example of coal mining. So when you blow up a mountain to extract coal, there's like basically a series of GDP plus signs. There's no minus signs. So the first one is the coal itself. So that's economic growth, value created. Coal miners are working hard. There's explosives that are going off, more economic growth, the production and deployment of those explosives. Then there's the river that has to be cleaned up by the kind of debris over the explosions. And so the kind of state hires people to go clean up the river. And that's also economic growth, GDP, job creation. And then there's the coal miners themselves who have this thing called black lung disease. And it's pretty bad thing, and they have to go to the hospital, and then the doctors have more work, so that's also economic growth. And there's no accounting for nature and human health in this equation, and that's kind of like what our models are today.
Can I give an example I'd like to use when I
Please.
do my lectures? So it's the three nurses. So the first nurse is a Catholic nurse. She's not getting paid. She's healing people, but she's neutral for GDP. Then you have a public hospital doing the same job, paid by the government. She's negative for GDP, she's a cost. And then you have a private nurse working in a private hospital, and she's growing GDP positively. So in a commodity regime, you have these three nurses doing the same job, and they're judged entirely differently. If you have a contributory regime, they're all doing the same job. They're all recognized for the value they've for healing people, whether they work in a private, public, or religious sector, right? So this is basically just to enhance your analogy that the system that we have now doesn't work because we completely ignore negative social and ecological externalities. We just don't count them. We don't see them.
Yeah, this is a really beautiful conversation and something that's close to my heart because what you're getting at is ultimately like game theoretic scenarios where everything is a race to the bottom or an arms race, or what we would call a Molochian dynamic, where people are trying to optimize for their short-term benefits at the expense of collective well-being. And that's an absolutely horrible scenario to be in. So how can we continue to rectify these problems with funding? I think about Kevin a lot and his idea of quadratic funding, but there's other funding mechanisms and potentially we could apply to parallel societies that might be beneficial to get outside of these dynamics as well.
Yeah. Just one reaction. Quadratic funding is not my idea. It's Vitalik and Glenn's. I'm just
I just meant your your promotional idea.
Part of the movement. Yeah. I think that at some level, a lot of these things can be stated as coordination failures. A coordination failure is any time you have a group of humans that want to create X outcome, but they can't articulate that outcome, or they can't find ways to coordinate their resources in order to achieve that outcome. And one of the things I think that's really cool about blockchains is that they're kind of the stateful internet. They're programmable. And so you can build these little circuits that help people coordinate around their shared needs and ideally solve coordination failures where basically each of the agents in the system can have more confidence that each of the other agents are going to converge on solving that issue. And so that's getting into the realm of mechanism design. How do we build systems that create credible commitments that we're going to solve shared problems together in the most generalized sense? And one of the things that I've sort of stumbled upon since founding Gitcoin is just that there's really dozens of really cool capital allocation mechanisms, coordination mechanisms out there that can be used to help fund our shared needs or coordinate towards solving these problems. And they range from things that were developed eons ago during when we were hunter-gatherers. How do we coordinate our resource allocation, to the agrarian, to the industrial information age, and now I call this era the on-chain era. There's a certain amount of mechanisms that only could exist now that we have blockchains. And I recently wrote a book called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook, which sounds like a mouthful, but just capital allocation is just spending resources and doing it on chain. And so I wrote a book called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook and went through a couple dozen of these different mechanisms. And I'm just trying to spread awareness of what's available out there in order to solve these problems. And I'd say that there's sort of like a primordial soup of mechanism designers and experimentation and people deploying capital and trying to figure out which of these mechanisms are going to scale and become the backbone of capital flows in these parallel societies in the future. But it's the first inning, it's the first quarter in terms of actually bearing these out in progress. And so I'm really curious to see what happens over the next couple of years in exploring this design space. And I think that, I have a ton of access as the founder of Gitcoin to a lot of these big brains, and my job in writing the book is just democratizing that access. So you can get a copy of the book at allobook.gitcoin.co, ALLO book.gitcoin.co. And if you're not someone who reads all that much, there's a GPT that's read the book that you can chat with about these ideas, and that's kind of a fun way of exploring the design space as well.
Nice. So let's throw a little bit of a wrench in the gears. In thinking about this, if we were talking to a state-based bureaucrat or a politician, they may say, well, we have solutions for a lot of these problems that you guys are going to face, and we call it ESG, environmental sustainable governance models, that the corporate and the legacy system architectures have started to embrace and is really popular. So why will that not work, or why is that not working, and how is what we're going to do better?
I'll take this first. So I believe that in the kind of process of industrialization, we now have these complex societies where the decision makers and capital allocators are so disconnected from the grassroots that we don't really, or let's say these decision makers don't have a direct feedback loop, and they don't, maybe they're well-intentioned, but it's difficult for them to have visibility on the ground, and maybe these kind of grassroots community networks aren't incorporated and aren't, the feedback isn't coming back into the system. And so my counter would be, how can we enable these kind of democratic and experimental allocation systems and encourage these like larger funding bodies to start running pilots that enable and empower the grassroots and the people that are actually connected to the ground, connected to community needs, connected to the earth, connected to nature, feeling the direct results of the tragedy of the commons, and letting them do that allocation work.
Yeah, this reminds me of Michel. Yeah, he's already laughing. Okay, we had a little bit of a discussion before this panel, and he said in the scenario as you envision it, there is no tragedy of the commons. There can't be in this case.
Right. So this famous, it's actually the most read scientific article in the history of the world, right? Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. I belong to those people who say it doesn't exist, but let me explain why. Because he's not talking about the commons. He's talking about open access resources that have no rules, and the commons are defined through self-regulation. So that's where it got completely wrong. So in Latin you have res nullius, what belongs to no one, and res communis, what belongs to a community. The commons belong to a community that self-organizes the protection of its resources. And you know, you look at satellite image of the world, and ask yourself, where is it green? It's very easy: Austria, Switzerland, Japan, because their mountain flanks are commons, and these communities have protected their own, natural environment for generations, right? So the tragedy of the commons is non-governed, non-protected resources that are for everyone. And then obviously selfishness will play its role and will deplete it. So we should call the tragedy of the commons the tragedy of the non-commons. Or even maybe the tragedy of the market, because actually what's happening is that people are then selfishly using these common resources and selling them on the market. So it's really a very misleading theory in my view.
Yeah, and something I'm thinking about with these funding mechanisms, I think a lot about how they can actually alter and change our communities as we move forward, parallel societies, network states, whatever the community is. Somehow it seems like the funding mechanisms themselves have the ability to alter the dynamics that allow those communities to thrive. And so is that how you guys also envision that? You see the dynamics of funding itself changing communities on a fundamental level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the word that comes to mind here as we're describing this is the word institution, which is something that's sort of like something that's rigid and hard and can be depended upon for achieving a certain set of outcomes. In the industrial age, our institutions are these, at least in the West, there are these sort of like giant marble buildings that you walk into, and they're sort of majestic, and things like courts, things like banks, things like the local government, and they're where decisions are made that are existential in creating culture and, institutions, which are the things that are outside of the institutions, things that are soft, things like culture, things like the relationship, things like the arts, a lot of the things that we hold near and dear, I would describe as institutions. So institutions, hard, rigid, can be depended upon, and exstitutions are the human culture and the society that have been built around them, and they're just an inversion of each other. And now that we're going on chain, we can create digital hardness and programmable money and programmable institutions. And so we're building these capital allocation networks that, since we can program our values into our money, really the design space is more or less infinite, and we can decide what those things look like. But, the world I want to live in is having solid infrastructure and funding the arts and funding the commons, in addition to all the great for-profit things that are out there as well. And, so I think there's an opportunity to support people who are creating institutions that are regenerative in culture and arts and all the other things that we hold dear in our families and in our communities. And the institutions in the industrial age were these physical meat space things, and now the institutions can be on-chain institutions, and the institutions inform the institutions, and vice versa. So there's sort of an ebb and flow there, and it's a really beautiful design space. I mean, we can program our values into our money. It's really profound, and I hope that we explore the design space and create something really meaningful.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I wanted to add how kind of I've seen funding flows shape communities and projects. So it's really common in the nonprofit world for an organization to receive a grant, use that grant to do a project, and then maybe even scale up because they've been told that they're going to get follow-on funding if they succeed in XYZ, and then it doesn't come through. And then they've basically scaled up, increased their burn rate, and they have to lay people off or cancel the project, and then they have less trust of funders in the future. And this is kind of like something that I've seen shape the nonprofit space. And to cite an example, I see some Octant folks in the audience experimenting with combining kind of traditional endowment models with quadratic funding and democratic community participation to enable kind of like continuous funding flows using a kind of non-depletive treasury. And I wonder, like, it'd be fun to think about, like if Logos is thinking about these things, and You guys have spoken with Octane, I'm sure, and yeah, I don't know if.
Well, what I'm thinking about now is actually I'm going to venture off the reservation a little bit in the sense that if somebody here in the audience, they're building some public good infrastructure like we're doing at Logos, like you guys touched on it, but maybe they're really confused. How do they actually plug into these funding ecosystems? Like can they get funding quick, efficiently, in a way that is sustainable and meets their community's needs in the way that we're talking about? So how can they get involved and get funded like ASAP?
Yeah, I mean, like Gitcoin is generally the first place I send people to.
Yeah, that's gonna be my answer too. Use Gitcoin. No, I'm shitposting. There's a bunch of really great experiments. I'm familiar more with the Ethereum ecosystem, but Optimism retro funding, Gitcoin, Octane. There's some stuff in Arbitrum that's really mature, and so there's a plurality of different options out there, and I know that's annoying that there's not just one of them, but actually the plurality is a feature because it creates anti-fragility it creates a diversity in different funding mechanisms and implementations, and that's actually really important because if one of them goes away, then you still have all of the others. So the answer is that there's many places that you can go in the Ethereum ecosystem, and I'm sure that as Logos and other blockchains grow, they'll also have a plurality of funding mechanisms as well.
Nice. Okay, I think we have a little over 8 minutes left, and I think maybe right now is a good time to take a couple of questions, but give it a round of applause for these guys. This is an amazing discussion. This is like the super heady Giga Brain Trust hardcore guys. Thank you so much. So if you guys, I guess we can line up now for questions, right? How does that work? Somebody? Yeah.
There's a mic in the middle there.
A mic in
If
the
you want
middle?
to step up to that.
Yeah.
I think the most effective way to fundraising is like launch a meme coin, but meme coin just for the traders. So if we can like launch a token for builders, like your contribution and your maybe your skills contribute to this smart contract, and then you can get that coin. Maybe it would be great way. I'm not sure because in past I worked for a DAO for a long time, and actually I host a lot of like online event, online workshop. There are lots of people, they can use their spare time to coordinate with each other and can make some very useful thing. But the most challenging for them is like funding, is related with funding allocation. I mean, before funding coming, they can coordinate with each other very, very good. But after funding coming, I mean, if they have the fee, the coordination way will be very, very hard. So is there any like very, very easy way to like cooperation with each other? So like launch a token for builders, building as exchange for token. How about this idea?
So you're just to make sure we're clear on the question. So it's about how do we cooperate? If you're like a community or group and you want to cooperate to get funding, how would you go about it? Is that what you're getting at? Because I only caught parts of your question. Sorry.
Yeah. It is my question is that I mean, for traders, how to like coordination with them, launch a meme coin. If you believe, you just buy it. So like for builders, if you want to cooperation with each other more efficient, if you believe it, you just build it, and then you can get some like token back, and then in future that would be more like a utility. I'm not sure. I mean, just like launch a token for builders as easy as launch meme coin. Meme coin, yeah.
I could share a few existing examples that I've seen that kind of touch parts of it. So one is the talent protocol, which enables on-chain kind of skill recognition attestation of builders, which in the future could enable, let's say, airdrops and retro payouts to builders that have contributed. Another one is the Protocol Guild, which is an Ethereum kind of developer guilds that receives not just ETH at this point, but a number of other tokens from layer 2 ecosystems that are dependent on the Ethereum layer 1 for their continuous functionality. So that's like a way that various ecosystems are rewarding public goods builders. Had another one, but it's kept my mind.
Can I give the example of grassroots economics, maybe, because I think that's such an exemplary project. So, okay, I may have some things wrong, but bear with me. So, basically, in Kenya, like in many other many other countries in the global south, we have these rotational savings and loans associations. Basically, usually groups of women who put some money every month or every week, and then every week or every month, somebody member gets the whole pot, right? And so that allows you to buy a mobile phone, a fridge, something that poor people normally cannot access. So they asked 1,000 of these 4,000 groups to give some money for a common fund as collateral and build a mutual credit on top of it. Although Will Ruddick says it's not mutual credit, so I'm not sure how to call it, but it looks like mutual credit. And so basically you introduce like a multiplier effect, so you have 20% money and you have 80% of this credit currency, right? So suddenly you have times 4 what you had. He put a blockchain on it to make it transparent, and they discovered they have like a 6-fold accelerator. So now people can fund, this project, and they know that their investment will go 6 times bigger. Then he introduced something called Ostrom contracts. So instead of individual smart contracts, they are collective contracts, commitment pooling. And now he's doing this cyber physicalization of ancient sharing practices. So it's basically talking with elders how they used to do, commoning and gifting in their communities, and try to scale it through these systems. I think that's fantastic because that's really rooted in real people doing real things and using the blockchain to kind of augment and scale up what they're already doing. So that I think that's a perfect example of, improving coordination and using the blockchain in a very, very smart way, to just put more grease in these dynamics.
Thank you. One more question, and very quick question and answer, and then we're out.
So Kevin, all this incredible hard work that you've been doing, yet the majority of your pool was funded by a dog coin. How does that make you feel?
Incredible. So there's a $20 million matching pool for Gitcoin, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's been multiple $1 million of generous donations from DeFi projects and NFT projects in the 2019 and 2020 cycle. And then we also had a NFT launch in 2020 that was called the Moonshot Bots, and that raised $3 million. And then the dog coins were like $4 million. And then it's appreciated from there. So it's actually only like a fourth dog coins. Yeah, but we live in a world where you can fund public goods with dog coins.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at is, in a sideways way, like what is the role of these kind of mimetic tokens and this value creation out of thin air going into public goods? Where do you see the funneling of that into more public good regenerative?
Sorry, guys, 20 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, Dogwif has a 100x more valuation than Gitcoin, so clearly you're asking the wrong guy, but it seems like there's something there. And I know the latest meta is AI meme coins. So, maybe someone who's involved in that scene can say what it is. But the other thing that I'll mention is the Regen token, which seems to be doing good stuff with meme coins, or they call them culture coins. So there's a design space there. Doing it ethically and doing it well is not something I know about, though.
Cool. Thank you so much, guys. Give them a round of applause. This was an amazing panel.
Thanks, Sterling.
Oh, no problem.